The morning sun had barely lifted itself over the city when Arya Hale tied the fraying ribbon of her apron and stepped into a life that was never meant to be hers, at least not that day. What she did not know, as daylight spilled across marble floors and polished glass, was that this single decision would quietly rearrange two broken lives, stitching them together in the most unexpected way. If you believe that kindness deserves second chances and that ordinary people can change extraordinary lives, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Journal. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Arya was not a maid by choice. She was a community college student who worked mornings at a neighborhood bakery and spent afternoons caring for her younger brother after their mother passed away. That day, her older sister Mira had called before sunrise, her voice weak with fever, asking Arya to cover her shift just once at the corporate guesthouse attached to a towering financial firm. Arya hesitated only long enough to picture the unpaid electricity bill folded on the kitchen table. She agreed, unaware that the building she was walking into housed a man who had not smiled freely in years. The guesthouse was bright and quiet, bathed in clean daylight and the hush of wealth that made every footstep feel louder than it was. Arya moved carefully, her hands steady as she cleaned meeting rooms and refreshed hallways, trying to disappear into the background. She carried herself with a gentleness shaped by loss, the kind that made people feel calm without knowing why. By mid-morning, she was assigned to the executive floor, a place where the windows stretched wide and the air felt heavier with responsibility. That was where Julian Cross lived most of his days. As chief risk officer of one of the city's most powerful firms, his job was to see danger before it arrived, to protect others by anticipating loss. Ironically, it was the one skill he could not use in his personal life. Julian was a single father raising his daughter alone since his wife died suddenly 3 years earlier. The grief had settled into his bones, and the pressure of his role had built walls around him. He was respected, admired, and quietly exhausted. Julian's daughter, Eloan, spent that day in the guesthouse lounge while her father prepared for an all-day board session. She was 9 years old, small for her age, with careful movements and eyes that carried memories no child should have to hold. An accident years earlier had left scars across her arms and shoulder, pale lines that caught the light and drew unwanted stares. Since then, Eloan rarely spoke and avoided people whenever she could. Julian had learned to accept her silence as protection, though it broke him every time Arya first noticed Eloan sitting alone near the tall windows, sunlight warming the floor around her. The child was tracing patterns on the glass with one finger, her backpack clutched tightly at her side. Something about the way she held herself stopped Arya in her tracks. It reminded her of her brother after their mother's funeral, the way children fold inward when the world feels too sharp. Without thinking, Arya slowed her pace, making no sudden movements, simply existing nearby as she wiped tables and straightened chairs. Hours passed quietly. Julian moved in and out of meetings, barely registering the presence of the substitute maid. His mind was buried in forecasts and numbers, in risks that could cost millions. Each time he glanced toward the lounge, he felt a familiar tightness when he saw Eloan alone. He told himself she was safe, that solitude was her choice, that he was doing his best. Still, guilt followed him like a shadow. It was near midday when something shifted. Arya noticed Eloan drop her pencil and freeze, her breath shallow as a group of visiting executives walked by. The child's shoulders tensed, her eyes fixed on the floor. Arya recognized the signs of panic instantly. She did not rush or draw attention. She simply sat on the opposite side of the room, pulled a small notebook from her pocket, and began to draw slow, looping shapes, her movements deliberate and calm. Eloan noticed. Slowly, cautiously, she watched the pencil glide across paper. The room softened. Without a word, Arya slid a spare pencil across the floor and turned the notebook slightly, leaving space. Eloan hesitated, then reached out. She began to draw too, her lines shaky at first, then steadier. Two strangers shared silence in daylight, and it was enough. Julian returned to the lounge later and stopped short at the sight. His daughter was sitting beside the maid, their heads bent over a page filled with simple shapes and small suns. Eloan's posture was relaxed, her breathing even. Julian felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Relief, followed by confusion, followed by a sharp ache he had learned to suppress. Arya noticed him immediately and stood, apologizing silently with her eyes. Julian surprised himself by shaking his head. He thanked her quietly, his voice rough from disuse in moments that mattered. Arya only nodded, her expression kind but distant, as if she understood more than he had said. Over the following days, Myra's illness stretched longer than expected, and Arya continued covering the shift. Each day, she crossed paths with Julian and Eloan in small, almost invisible ways. She left clean towels folded into gentle shapes. She placed fresh flowers where Eloan sat. She brought quiet steadiness into rooms that had forgotten warmth. Eloan began to look for her, and Julian began to notice himself doing the same. Arya learned fragments of their story through observation rather than conversation. She saw the way Julian paused before touching his daughter's scarred arm, afraid of causing pain. She noticed how Eloan flinched at sudden noise yet leaned toward calm voices. In return, Julian saw the fatigue in Arya's eyes, the way she stretched her back as if carrying weight far heavier than a mop bucket. He sensed a life shaped by responsibility and quiet courage. One afternoon, sunlight flooded the guesthouse as Eloan stood hesitantly in the open space near the windows. Music from a distant event drifted faintly through the building, a soft melody barely audible. Eloan swayed almost imperceptibly, her feet shifting as if remembering something joyful from long ago. Arya, passing by, slowed and mirrored the movement just enough to make it feel safe. Eloan took a step. Then another. The scars on her arms caught the light, no longer hidden. Julian watched from the corridor, his breath caught in his throat. He had not seen his daughter move like that since before the accident. Tears burned behind his eyes as he realized how starved he had been for this moment. The change was subtle but powerful. Eloan's laughter did not return all at once, nor did Julian's grief disappear. But something softened. Trust began to grow in the spaces between them. Arya never overstepped, never demanded attention. She simply showed up, day after day, offering kindness without expectation. When Mira finally recovered, Arya prepared to return to her own life. On her last morning, she cleaned the executive floor more slowly than usual, aware that endings sometimes arrive without warning. Julian felt it too, though he could not explain why the building felt emptier already. As Arya turned in her borrowed uniform, Julian found her near the service elevator. He thanked her again, more sincerely this time, acknowledging how much she had helped his daughter. Arya smiled, accepting the gratitude without claiming credit. She spoke briefly of her sister, her studies, her family. Julian listened, really listened. For the first time in years. That afternoon, Eloan hugged Arya unexpectedly, her small arms wrapping around her waist. The gesture was brief but fierce. Arya blinked back tears, knowing that some connections do not need time to become real. Life did not transform overnight. Arya returned to her routines, to early mornings and late nights. Julian returned to his meetings, to risks and responsibilities. Yet something had changed. Julian found himself making different choices, leaving work earlier, listening more closely. Eloan carried her notebook everywhere, filling it with shapes and sunlight. Weeks later, Julian reached out, offering Arya a permanent role within the guesthouse, one focused on community programs for visiting families. It was not charity, and it was not pity. It was recognition. Arya accepted, understanding that sometimes help arrives disguised as opportunity. As the months passed, the guesthouse became a warmer place. Eloan grew more confident, her scars no longer something to hide. Julian learned that strength did not always mean control, and Arya discovered that her quiet kindness had value beyond survival. If this story touched your heart, if you felt even a small spark of hope while listening, please take a moment to like, comment, and share this video. Your engagement helps spread stories that remind us we are not alone. Before this story ends, we have a special request for you. Please comment the word kindness if you believe that small acts can change lives more than grand gestures ever could. In the end, it was not a dramatic rescue or a sweeping declaration that healed them. It was daylight, patience, and a young woman who said yes to helping her sister, never knowing she would help a father and daughter find their way back to each other. And sometimes, that is how the most powerful stories begin.